Hear this story from the 20th chapter of Matthew. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace, and he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock, he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." When evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you've made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I'm generous?" So the last will be first, and the first will be last. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I wonder if we human beings are capable of making it through an entire day without uttering one complaint to others or to ourselves. I have my doubts. We complain about, well, everything. The weather, the traffic, the checkout line at the grocery store. The younger generation complains about the older generation being out of touch. The older folks complain about the younger folks being irresponsible. We complain about having to get up in the morning. We complain about having to go to bed at night. We even complain about people who complain. A travel agency in Britain has compiled a list of what it calls the most ridiculous complaints made by vacationers. Here's some of what's on that list. The beach was too sandy. We booked an excursion to a water park, but no one told us we had to bring our swimsuits and towels. I was bitten by a mosquito. No one said they would bite. My fiance and I booked a twin-bedded room, but we were placed in a double-bedded room. My fiance and I now hold you responsible for the fact that I find myself pregnant. This would not have happened if you had put us in the room that we booked. Let me go on. There's the story told about a young Catholic priest who decided to enter a monastery. The one he entered was known for being particularly strict. The head monk told the young priest that he would be sworn to total silence. Not one word was to be uttered. The only exception was that they were allowed to say 2 words every 10 years. So after a decade of total silence, the head monk indicated it was time for the priest-turned-monk to speak his 2 words. The monk said, "Bed hard." And then he returned to his silent study and work. Another 10 years passed. Again, the monk had his opportunity to speak his 2 words. He said, "Food bad." Yet another 10 years passed. When it came time for him to say his 2 words, the monk said, "I quit." Head monk shook his head and said, "I knew this was coming. You've done nothing but complain for the last 30 years. Our complaining begins at an early age. Anthony Wolfe has written a book for parents about the tougher parts of their job, and the title says it all. It's not fair. Jeremy Spencer's parents let him stay up all night. If Anthony Wolfe had written a book back in the time when the Israelites were journeying through the wilderness toward Canaan, he could have entitled it, "It's Not Fair." The Pharaoh may have enslaved us in Egypt, but at least he fed us. By the time we catch up with them in this morning's readings from Exodus, the Israelites, estimated to be more than 2 million in number, have been in the wilderness for about 6 weeks. They'd left Egypt with a month's worth of food and provisions, so they're going on 2 weeks now without much at all to eat. They're hungry, they're anxious, and they're angry. Already, they're having selective amnesia about their life in captivity. They can easily recall eating their fill of Pharaoh's pot pies from the flesh pots, but they seem to have quickly forgotten Pharaoh's iron-tight grip around their necks that was strangling the life out of them. And so they complained to Moses and Aaron. But it's not the first time they've done this. When they saw Pharaoh's army closing in on them at the banks of the Red Sea, they grumbled to Moses that he had brought them into the wilderness to die. But they didn't die. Instead, they witnessed God's mercy in action through Moses as the sea waters parted so that they could cross safely on dry ground. Not long after that, they went through a 3-day stint without any water to drink. And when they did come upon water, it was too bitter. So they gave Moses an earful yet again, convinced they were going to die. But they didn't die. Instead, they experienced God's mercy in action through Moses as the bitter water became sweetened so they could quench their parchness. And now this. At this point, they are hangry. Hangry is one of the newer words in our vocabulary. It combines hungry and angry, and it describes that kind of situation when the blood sugar drops and the blood pressure rises. It's not a good combination. Just within this one passage, the Israelites complain and murmur 7 times. Long ago, in commenting on this passage, John Wesley wrote, "Discontent magnifies the past, vilifies what is present without regard to truth or reason. None talk more absurdly than murmurers." And yet, with all due respect to Mr. Wesley, it's not that their fear and anger were displaced. After all, the Israelites' guaranteed source of food was way back behind them in Egypt, and they didn't really know where they were going. It's not that their feelings were bad or wrong, or that our feelings are bad or wrong. Feelings are just feelings, after all. They're part of the phenomenon of being human. The challenge is that in the midst of the fear and the anxiety and the suffering and the need, how do we maintain the presence of mind to recall the unending care, the recurring compassion, the unfailing mercy that God had demonstrated for them and for us time and time again? Back a handful of years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Phil Bembauer, who at the time was among the ranks of retired ministers in the Presbytery of East Tennessee. Phil had served the Presbyterian Church in several places and several capacities over the course of his ministry. He died in 2011. In one of his sermons, Phil shared a story that happened when he was a pastor in Ohio. He nearly tripped over a piece of wood one day as he stepped off a curb. It was an 18-inch stake of yellow pine that was sharpened on one end and had the word tree written down the side. Why that stick was there, I have no idea, he said. But he continued, since it had the word tree written on it, and there was a place near the curb in my front yard where a nice tree would look good, I brought the stake home and I planted it. Phil checked that stake every day to see if anything was developing, but nothing was evident. And then some 2 weeks later, he came home to find that the stake was missing, and in its place was a 3-foot wide hole with dirt piled up beside it. 5 more days went by. Morning and evening, Phil went out and checked the hole, but nothing. On the evening of the 6th day, however, a remarkable thing had happened. When Phil arrived home, he found a beautiful 8-foot-tall maple tree growing out of the hole. It was carefully wired to a supporting stake, and it had mulch all around it. It was a miracle. Back in the wilderness, God heard the Israelites' cries, recognized their need, and responded with meat and bread through quails and manna. Now, volumes have been written about how quails and manna came to be. Scholars say the Israelites were camped in the migratory path of quails. And they contend that the manna God caused to rain down from heaven was a natural phenomenon, specifically the sticky, sweet secretion of insects that feed on the tamarisk trees in the desert. It decays quickly, it disintegrates when the heat of the day kicks in, and so a day's worth is all that can be gathered. The Bedouins in that region today still gather it. However, other scholars, most notably John Calvin, argue that the manna was anything but ordinary. It was, in Calvin's words, contrary to the order of nature, and therefore had to have been provided miraculously, supernaturally by God to feed the Hebrew people. Barbara Brown Taylor has weighed in on the debate. She writes, does manna have to come out of nowhere to qualify as a miracle? Or is the miracle that God heard the complaining of hungry people and fed them with bug juice, with food it would have never occurred to them to eat? Or to put it another way, what makes something bread from heaven? Is it the thing itself, or is it the one who sends it? How you would answer those questions has a lot to do with how you sense God's presence in your life. If your manna has to drop straight out of heaven looking like a perfect loaf of buttercrust bread, then chances are you're going to go hungry a lot of the time. When you do not get the miracle you're praying for, you're going to think that God is not there. You're going to start comparing yourself to other people and wondering why they seem to have more to eat than you do, and you may start complaining to heaven about that. That was the problem the day laborers were having in the parable that Mary read. Those who had been hired first thing in the morning and had worked the entire day actually I read that, didn't I? Those who had been hired first thing in the morning and had worked the entire day watched as those who came near the end of the day were paid the same amount of wages. It's not fair, the first group said. We worked all day. They only worked an hour, and you're going to pay them the same amount. The owner of the vineyard replied to the ones who'd been working all day, friends, I've not been unfair. You and I had an agreed upon wage, didn't we? I've paid you what I promised. So take it and go. I decided to give to those who came last the same amount as you. It's my money, and it's between them and me. My concern and desire is that everyone have what they need and that everyone have enough. Seriously, are you going to be offended by my generosity? Grace is outlandish and radical in that way, isn't it? It really is a hard concept to squeeze into these minds of ours that are so conditioned to work for everything we get and to think that everyone else should do the same. Grace is outlandish, and so are miracles. It's outlandish to think that God rained bread down from heaven on miserable whiners who had pitiful short-term memory when it came to remembering God's mercy in their lives. And what's even more outlandish is that the bread storm from heaven continues even today, although if we're looking for a perfect loaf to drop from the skies, we just may miss it. Sometimes, many times, we are actually partners in the making of miracles. Back to the story about Phil and that maple tree sapling that appeared miraculously in his front yard. There is more to the story. Turns out similar wooden stakes like the one Phil almost tripped over had produced similar maple saplings all over town. A beautification committee was planting trees on streets that didn't have them, and by some fluke, Phil's front yard had been omitted when the markers were being staked. And so when he found a loose stake, he decided to rectify the situation and plant it appropriately, hoping the tree planting folks would do the rest. And they did. Thus, the miracle. Phil writes, my act of placing the stake when and where it might do some good was the key element in the performance of my miracle. The tree planting crew, whom I never saw, did their part too, of course, but if I hadn't done what I did when I did it, that particular tree would not today be growing in that particular spot. He says, now, since I've explained it, you probably don't classify my experience as a miracle. And you're right. But on the other hand, how would you define a miracle? Is it only a miracle when it involves a magic wand and special words and poof, there it is, whatever it is? Or does the term miracle cover more than that? What if the manna back in the wilderness had been there all along, but the Israelites had a new awareness that bug juice was edible? Either way, it came from God. As one preacher puts it, if you regard everything you have as coming to you from God, then there will be no end to the manna in your life. A can of beans will be manna. Grits will be manna. Bug juice will be manna. Nothing will be too ordinary or too transitory to remind you about God. When you go to bed hungry and you wake up to find a fine, flaky substance on the ground, you'll say, "What is it?" And someone will tell you it's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. And you will believe it. You will say, "Thanks be to God," and start trying to figure out how to eat the stuff. Give us this day our daily bread.